One meeting, 47 minutes. And somehow, according to whispers that never made it to cameras, everything changed the second Meghan Markle stepped out of Highgrove, because what happened inside wasn't reconciliation, it was a warning.
Breaking today, Meghan Markle breaks her agreement with King Charles and Buckingham Palace to leak to her friends at People magazine less than a week after that promised meeting.
Everybody in the family now understands that Meghan is an adversary and needs to be treated as such.
Anybody who leaves their so-called loving partner to face the world's media alone when you've lost a mega court case is certainly not somebody standing by you. And you will also notice what was interesting, that even though they knew about the Emmy nomination.
On Harry's mind is Harry and Meghan, and on Meghan's mind is Meghan, but sometimes Harry.
Most definitely. Well, it's my view that she's pathologically transactional, and she's American. As you know, Americans don't like losers.
This confused and angry, spoiled brat can never admit he was wrong, can never admit that he's, done a terrible thing in bringing this entire losing case and wasting perhaps £50 million in legal costs.
That room expecting a father's embrace, and instead walking out with something colder, something sharper, something that doesn't show up in photographs but lingers in silence long after the doors close. Because here's what no one is saying out loud: those 47 minutes weren't about healing anything. They were about setting limits. And the moment Meghan Markle realized that, the entire narrative cracked.
Contravenes what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had agreed with the palace, which was that there was to be no briefing around this visit to try and shape the narrative in favour of one party. But she can't help herself, can she? So this is the cover report where People says the Duchess planned to be by her husband's side for several outings.
Before those 47 minutes at Highgrove, understand where everything stood, not just physically, but strategically, emotionally, financially, reputationally. For years, a story had been carefully built, repeated, reinforced, defended, reshaped whenever needed. But something had shifted. The same story that once commanded attention had started losing its grip. Contradictions were stacking. Public perception was changing, and quietly behind closed doors, the palace had stopped reacting.
Ian was very much across the meeting. He knew exactly why the king wanted to do it. He wasn't having any of it, not interested, but understood. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about the monarchy, how you have to be careful because the king is the king is the king. You get the picture.
That's where this moment becomes dangerous, because when someone walks into a room expecting negotiation, expecting emotional leverage, expecting even a symbolic victory, and instead receives structure, protocol, and boundaries, that's not just rejection, that's recalibration. And insiders, the kind who don't speak on record but always seem to know, suggest that what Meghan Markle faced wasn't confrontation in the loud sense. It was something much more unsettling. Calm, controlled, final.
Of course he's going to say yes. He's a kind man, really, the king. He's not going to not want to see his grandchildren.
Okay, is he a weak man, though, Jobbo? Too.
Yeah, but it's difficult, isn't it? You're living with cancer. You've got a certain amount of finite time in your life. I mean, he's seeing all sorts of people behind the scenes. Michael Fawcett, who was got rid of as well. A lot of people being seen in this period because, of course, a man without living with that, he doesn't know how long he's got, and so he's not going to turn that down. And that may be seen as weakness, but it certainly wouldn't have happened on the Queen's watch. The late Queen's watch, and I don't think it would happen if it was Prince William.
And this is where the alleged warning begins to take shape, not spoken like a threat, not delivered like an argument, but implied through every detail of how that meeting was handled. Because nothing about it looked like family. No shared meal, no relaxed conversation, no extended time, just 47 minutes. Timed, structured, contained. Think about what that communicates without a single direct sentence. When you are brought in under strict conditions, when the environment feels official rather than personal, when every movement feels observed, when every second is controlled, it doesn't need to be said out loud. The message is already clear. You are not negotiating terms, you are being reminded of them. And then comes the part that insiders keep circling back to: the separation. The decision to bring Prince Harry in alone first, not together, not united. That wasn't random, that wasn't logistical, that was deliberate. Because separating people changes the dynamic completely. It removes performance. It removes reinforcement. It isolates truth from narrative. And outside inside waiting, watching, calculating. Because waiting in this context is not passive. Waiting is positioning. Waiting is power being displayed without confrontation. Hours of movement around Highgrove, delays that felt intentional, timing that stretched just enough to unsettle but not enough to be called out publicly. That's not chaos. That's choreography. And then, inside those 47 minutes, something reportedly shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Enough for insiders to quietly suggest that a private message was delivered not through raised voices, not through emotion, but through clarity so sharp it didn't need repeating. The kind of message that doesn't negotiate. The kind that draws a line. Because here's what makes this moment different from everything that came before. This wasn't about what was said publicly. This was about what was understood privately. That access is conditional. That association is not automatic. That presence does not equal belonging. And when Meghan Markle walked out, there were no photos, no carefully framed moment, no narrative anchor, just absence. And in a media environment where presence is everything, absence speaks louder than any statement. But here's where it gets more complicated, because while all of this was unfolding inside Highgrove, something else was happening outside. Life continued. Appearances were made. Roles were performed. And the contrast became impossible to ignore. One side operating within the system, the other trying to re-enter it. And insiders say that's where the real warning lands, not in words, but in realization. Because when the system doesn't react, doesn't bend, doesn't adapt to you, it forces a question you can't avoid anymore. And that question doesn't fade after the gates close, it follows Meghan Markle all the way out. Because what happened next wasn't louder, it was quieter. And somehow that made it even more unsettling. No official statement, no celebratory leak, no carefully timed photograph to reset the narrative, just a slow, almost invisible shift that insiders insist carried more weight than any public fallout. Because when a system like that responds with silence instead of engagement, it's not confusion, it's intention. And the intention here felt unmistakably precise. The kind of precision that doesn't react emotionally, doesn't argue, doesn't correct the record. It simply repositions everything without asking permission. And somewhere in the hours and days after those 47 minutes, that repositioning began to surface in ways that only people watching closely would even notice. The first sign wasn't dramatic, it was structural, subtle adjustments that looked administrative on the surface but carried deeper meaning underneath. The kind of internal recalibration that institutions use when they don't want to escalate but still need to establish control. Because what insiders keep repeating is that the meeting wasn't about fixing anything. It was about defining boundaries going forward, and once those boundaries are defined, everything else starts aligning around them automatically. Access changes, tone changes, expectations change, and most importantly, leverage disappears without needing to be taken away directly. That's what makes it so difficult to challenge, because nothing visible has been removed, yet everything feels different. And that's where the alleged private warning becomes clearer, not as a single sentence delivered in the room, but as a sequence of decisions that followed it, each one reinforcing the same unspoken message. The absence of any shared imagery wasn't an oversight, it was consistency. The lack of any extended engagement wasn't scheduling, it was design. The refusal to create even a symbolic moment wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Because when you deny someone the ability to frame a moment publicly, you remove the ability to control how that moment is remembered. And that is where narrative power quietly collapses. What insiders suggest is that Meghan Markle didn't just leave without a photo, Meghan Markle left without a foothold. And in a media environment built on perception, that absence becomes its own statement. At the same time, the contrast outside Highgrove continued to sharpen, not through confrontation, but through normalcy, which somehow made it more effective. Events continued, appearances unfolded, roles were performed without interruption, and that contrast between someone trying to re-enter and a system continuing without pause created a visual narrative that didn't need explanation. Because legitimacy doesn't announce itself, it just exists, and when it exists consistently, it becomes impossible to replicate through strategy alone. That's where the tension builds, not in what is said, but in what is seen. And once that contrast is visible, it starts to reshape perception faster than any statement ever could. And insiders insist this is where the real consequence of those 47 minutes begins. Not at the moment itself, but in the pattern that follows it. Because once a boundary is set in that environment, it doesn't reverse easily, it expands, quietly, steadily, almost invisibly, until it becomes the new normal. What was once possible becomes conditional. What was once once expected becomes uncertain, and what was once assumed begins to feel out of reach. That's how institutional shifts happen, not through sudden announcements, but through a series of small decisions that all point in the same direction until eventually there is no other direction left. What makes this moment even more complex is that it doesn't offer a clear reaction point. There's no single move to respond to, no direct confrontation to push back against, no public statement to correct, just an evolving reality that becomes harder to ignore with each passing day. And that's what insiders describe as the most unsettling part of all. Because when everything changes without anything being declared, you're left navigating something you can't fully see but can definitely feel. That's where pressure builds, not externally but internally, because the question stops being what happened in those 47 minutes and starts becoming what happens after them.